Another important function of writing and rhetorical mode that we need to be familiar with is what we call the analytical. So far, we have talked about the descriptive and the expository function of writing. And if you haven't gone through that video yet, and if you're not clear on what they are and how they function, please go through them first and then come to the analytical, because the analytical builds on these. As you remember, the analytical is the step that will take us closer to the argumentative. Now, to understand what we mean when we say analytical function of writing, let's have a look at a very quick, hopefully clear example. Consider this paragraph. The design of public spaces in urban areas often reflects deeper social inequalities. For example, park benches in many cities are deliberately designed to prevent homeless people from lying down using armrests or sloped surfaces. This practice, known as hostile architecture, prioritizes the comfort of certain groups while marginalizing others. By discouraging homeless individuals from using public spaces, these designs reinforce the exclusion of vulnerable populations. This raises critical questions about who public spaces are truly for and how urban design can perpetuate social divisions. Now, because we're asking what is the function of writing, our task is to look at a paragraph such as this one and to say what is it trying to do to us as readers. Is it trying to describe something and make us visualize it? Is it trying to convince us of something? Or is it trying to explain a statement that it makes? And in this particular case, what we notice is that the paragraph is introducing one main idea to us, and that idea is the way in which social inequalities are reflected in the design of public spaces. It's not proposing anything much beyond that, it just says that it raises critical questions. But if we say something as plain as the design of public spaces in urban areas often reflects deeper social inequalities and leave it as it is, it's not likely to be enough. People won't know what we mean, right? So the analytical mode of writing is concerned with how we get people to see the aspects that we're concerned with. So what's happening here is that the person who is writing this has made an observation. They have observed that, for instance, benches have armrests or sloped surfaces, right? That is at the level of plain noticing the environment and stating what is there. Benches have these things, right? But then we take an additional step and we say, why do benches have armrests or sloped surfaces? And that's where we identify a possible reason. Why is it? It's possibly to prevent people from lying down. Now, does this apply to everyone? Or can we identify a target recipient of this intervention? So, why is it happening once again? For whom is it happening? Against whom is it happening? And that's where we notice that this kind of treatment of benches is catering to the privileged. And what it does is it works against people who are underprivileged, people who are unhoused, who might want to use the benches to sleep on and not just to sit on in a dignified manner, which is what everyone else is expected to do. I use dignified obviously within inverted commas to say that the paragraph implies that the design prioritizes people whose lives are more acceptable, whose use of this bench is more acceptable, right? So by moving beyond the plain observation and into asking why, into asking, and so what are the consequences of this? What we're doing is to engage in analytical thinking. We're raising issues. And after we have done this, we're saying, and so what? So we realize that these are the impacts of such benches. We realize who they work against. And so what can we say as an outcome of this? So the paragraph tells us, public spaces then seem to not be truly for everyone. If they were for everyone, they would allow for people who are unhoused to use them just as well, which they don't. And so what if they are not for everyone? And so this kind of design reflects deeper social inequalities. So there is an inequality that exists in society, and the way in which design takes place reinforces this, caters to this inequality. It shows it in the manner of the design. So, what are we doing in the process of doing analysis, which is what we ask our students to do? We move from observation to an explanation, to an asking a how and why question about that observation. When it comes to writing our analysis, what we're doing is to move from a claim. The claim is the fact that the design of public spaces in urban areas reflects deeper social inequalities. We're moving from that claim to an example that allows us to explain the claim. Right? An example that allows our reader to understand why we are making that claim and what we are basing it on. And this distinction between the steps that we take in analyzing and the steps which might be the same or which might be a little different that we take in writing our analytical text, that distinction is essential for us to reckon with. And so we've come to the point where we're now asking, what is this analytical mode of writing? What is this analytical function of text? Its job is to read meanings into our observation. Its job is to interpret what we have observed, whether it be facts or objects or phenomena, something happening, someone doing something. In the analytical mode, we are breaking down that information into the parts out of which it is composed because we want to understand and we want to explain what are relationships between these parts. What's the relationship between the bench and the person who uses it? What's the relationship between the bench and the designer? What's the relationship between the designer's way of thinking and the society? What's the relationship between society and the various groups that form it, right? We want to explain these relationships and causes and effects and all the implications that emerge from there. And so, the analytical mode of writing performs a very specific function. Its job is to explain phenomena that we observe. Its job is to draw logical or chronological connections. This follows this. It may not be cause effect, but it may be in terms of time what happens, right? It identifies patterns and derives meaning. Remember that if you cannot see the pattern, you cannot ask what the pattern means. So if I haven't seen that, benches have begun to emerge at different points in the city, and these benches are no longer long stretches on which you can lie down, but they are divided in very tiny seats. If I don't see the pattern, then I cannot ask why is this pattern emerging, right? And what the analytical mode does is to make explicit what is happening within a phenomenon. It tells us what are the assumptions that are made, it articulates them, and it tells us why they are made and what they lead to. It is this aspect of analytical writing and analytical thinking that is connected to what we call critical thinking. Yeah? Critical thinking, which very often we talk about but we don't really know what we mean when we say it, is thinking that is guided by reason. It is thinking that is guided by a process of raising questions where we ask, what are the premises of this statement? What is it based on? What are the assumptions? What are the claims that we're making here? That is what critical thinking is, and this is why being very focused on analytical thinking and analytical writing is something that develops the ability to think critically. Now, the analytical mode of writing is associated with other modes like the narrative or the descriptive or the expository, the last two which we're already familiar with. How are they associated? They're associated because you need to have the description in order to analyze it. You may need the narration in order to explain something about what you're analyzing. You may need the exposition, the presentation of process, in order to finally draw the conclusions, have your inferences based on it. When we use the analytical mode of writing, what we do is to bring into use devices, which are smaller things, smaller techniques that help us write analytically. And what is it that we use in this case? We use things like definitions, explanations, illustrations, exemplification, classification, comparison or contrast or cause effect relationships which are pointed out. Now, these are very often used intuitively. The problem is that when our students are not able to use them intuitively, we need to be able to know that these things can be done, they can be used, so we can point them out, so we can help the students arrive at what they're lacking. Our intuition might function in our own writing, but unless we have the words and the terms of the things that help us write analytically, it will be difficult to guide students. Which is why we look at all of these devices and try to understand what they give us. For example, a definition, something like this: this practice, known as hostile architecture, prioritizes the comfort of certain groups while marginalizing others. It's not a direct definition. It's not saying hostile architecture is the kind of architecture that prioritizes whatever. No. What it does is to be integrated within the text, but within the text it feels the need to introduce a concept and it feels the need to explain it to make sure that the reader and the writer both understand this concept in the same way. Why do we do this? Because concepts are building blocks for our analysis. And if we use a word and mean different things by it, what it will lead to in terms of analysis is also going to be different, right? When we are writing analytically, we also sometimes use a narrative mode of presenting what we're talking about. What is this narrative mode? It's a mode in which we tell a story. That story doesn't have to be fiction and doesn't have to have characters. It can be the story of a place. Like, for instance, Stephen Smith, in this very brief text, tells us St. Leonard's churchyard has been the burial ground for Shoreditch since at least the 12th century. By the mid-19th century, the needs of the growing metropolitan population for new burial sites had completely overwhelmed the churchyard's capacity. The 1852 Burial Acts were enacted to address the toxic public health issues that resulted from this shortfall. The Act led to the establishment of burial boards, which raised funds to establish the many great Victorian metropolitan cemeteries away from congested churchyard. Since St. Leonard's churchyard has ceased to be an active burial ground, it has gradually evolved into a scruffy, much loved urban garden shaded by ancient London plane trees. It is a sanctuary for quiet contemplation, for chatting with friends, for lovers' assignations, and for the lonely, troubled, and homeless. Now, is this a plain story? Not quite. It tells us, it captures in one single paragraph the evolution of a place from the 12th century until the present. That is a very, very long story to capture. In the process, what does it do? It makes a selection. It chooses for us the points which are relevant and gives us only those. And in the process, it gives us reasons, it connects the law and the challenges and the changes. And so what it does is it introduces reasoning. It tells us this happened, this act was introduced, was enacted. And as a consequence, which is a logical step, as a consequence, burial boards were established. And as a consequence, funds were raised. And as a consequence, this churchyard was no longer used as a cemetery. And as a consequence, we have what we have now, which is a space which is a bit scruffy but much loved, which can be used for a variety of things. So this is not plain description, it is not plain narrative either, but it interprets the observations, it interprets the description, it interprets the knowledge, and it uses it in order to analyze what has happened. This is a narrative device used in aid of analysis. We can similarly use something like illustration or exemplification, where we introduce something and then we explain it. We add concrete detail. For instance, when we say something like, urban public transportation also demonstrates social exclusion. Imagine a city bus system designed with inaccessible stops, outdated scheduling, and a lack of affordability. We have made a statement, we have illustrated it, but it's still not very concrete. And then what we can do is to say, for example, in many cities, this is how bus routes are planned. Now imagine a single mother who lives on the outskirts of the city. She might need to walk 4 kilometers to the nearest bus stop, only to find that the bus doesn't come at the expected time. What have we done here? We have made the implications of what we're talking about concrete. So we have moved, not like in the analysis, between observation and the way we analyze it. But once again, we have stated our point of analysis, and then we have used an example to make sure that the reader gets what we're talking about. Now let's shift our ground a little bit so we're not tired of talking about similar things. Let's talk about how we use classification and analysis, but this time let's think back to the case study that we looked at. This is Priya, who was dealing with students who submitted assignments which were badly done or did not submit them or used AI. Now, Priya thinks that there are different things that she needs to do. Yeah? These things are classified. They are divided into categories that make sense together. So she thinks that what she needs to do is, one, to address the needs of the students who tried but could not express their opinion. And she decides how. She also needs to address the needs of the students who did a good job because they should not be punished. She also needs to have a separate discussion with the students who used AI. What are we doing here? We're classifying what Priya needs to do based on what? Based on the situation. What is the situation? The situation is the nature of the assignments that the students submitted. Yes, so our decision about this classification is a step in our analysis. Similarly, we can use comparison. We can use comparison to explain something like this. Given the time available, Priya thinks that she should focus her attention on the students who tried to do the work and did not manage it, because they are motivated and want to learn. By comparison, the students who used AI don't seem to be interested, and the ones who did a good job don't need her help. So, what is Priya doing? She's comparing the categories of students. Why? In order to decide which one of them is a priority. The analytical mode of writing is characterized by the necessity to point out things like cause-effect relationships. These cause-effect relationships are also what later on in argumentative writing is going to be used to articulate the premises, the claims, the implications of what we're talking about. So for example, Priya, the same Priya that we've been talking about, thinks that she should focus on building a sense of motivation and relevance among all the students. Why does she think that? Overall, that is what most of the students seem to lack. And she thinks if they had motivation and understood the relevance of what she's asking them to do, they would seek the help they need in order to do the assignment, whether from her or from their peers. Once they seek help, it would be easier for her to address their needs within the given time. And it is help that is sought which ends up being more useful than help that the student does not know that they need. So what is happening here? What's happening is that Priya is articulating slowly the way in which she analyzes the situation. What is it? Students don't know that they need help. If they don't know that they need help and she's trying to help them, they will not appreciate it. Point 2. Students don't know why the writing is relevant. If they don't know the writing is relevant, they don't want to do it, so they will not ask for help. And therefore, instead of just telling them how to do their assignments, what Priya plans to do is to focus on building a sense of motivation. What is she doing here? She's analyzing the situation. She's pointing out her observations. She's using these to draw conclusions from them. And she is spelling out the cause effect relationships. She's not just jumping to the conclusion that my students need more motivation. She's telling us why. And that is what characterizes the analytical function of writing and what will feed later on into argumentation. Because the previous forms, the previous rhetorical modes, are things which are usually useful for analytical writing. We use narrative in order to analyze, we use description and exposition in order to analyze. But the analysis itself is the stepping stone towards argumentation. So, if we look once again at this example, what we notice is that we can read it also as an implicit explanatory argument. We'll talk about types of arguments a little bit later, but for now, what we realize is that in a way, this paragraph is positing an implicit call to challenge this kind of practice through which social inequalities are deepened by the design of public spaces. Now, in real life, the analytical mode doesn't usually present itself as neatly as our first example. So let's look at the real text, which is actually beautifully written and very clear. It is a fragment from a section called Building a Social Imagination from Gautam Bhan's Cities Rethought, a new urban disposition which was recently published. The text says, starting from 2001, a set of legal petitions were submitted to the Delhi High Court challenging the constitutional validity of Section 377, a colonial era provision in the Indian Penal Code that criminalizes what it called voluntary carnal intercourse against the order of nature. Though nothing in its text necessitated this, in its everyday life, this section of law acted to criminalize same sex sexual relations. When the petitions were filed, queer life in Indian cities was hypervisible and invisible, an open secret that nevertheless had little recognizable footprint in the form of associations, movements, groups, and publics. Indeed, when the Government of India filed its reply in court to the petitions, it argued that there were in fact no gay people in India to be oppressed, and even if there were, queerness was not something Indian society was willing to think about, let alone accept. And one quick look at this particular text will show you the number of things that it brings together. It gives you a fact when the legal petitions were submitted in Delhi court. It gives you an explanation. What was challenged? What is this section 377? What does it do? What are its words? It also connects this to real life, and in the process of doing so, it makes a selection of what is relevant. It's already identifying a pattern. It also tells you that at the same time on the street, what was happening was a hypervisibility and an invisibility, and it explains this. And it also links this back once again to what the Indian government responded when they had to submit their reply in Indian court. So, what's happening here is that the text is answering a why and a how, and that's what makes it analytical. It makes the selection of relevant knowledge and observations, it makes those connections, and by doing this, it sets the stage for an argument about building a social imagination, which is the title of the section. Yes, so this is how texts usually operate. The writer makes a selection of what is relevant, and the text builds towards what it wants to convince us of. So, with this in mind, what we need to think about, and this is something that you need to spend time thinking for your own assignments, for your own classes, is where can we use this analytical mode? How do we introduce it to our students? This is something that can be used with all students. It's a little bit more difficult at the starting point, but it still is needed. It can be used in the beginning of processes of engaging with sites, no matter their size. It can be used in the beginning of research. It can be used in looking at context. It can be used along with observation to say, I'm seeing this, but so what? I'm seeing this, but why? With intermediate and advanced writing students, this writing analytical mode is used to set up the stage for their argumentation. It is used to explain what led to a specific conviction, to a specific decision in a project or in an intervention, and it is absolutely essential because you will often notice people proposing something but not being able to tell you why they're proposing that particular thing. That is where the analytical mode is crucial. And with this, we've come to the end of the second rhetorical mode, the second function of writing, and we will move into the difficult one, which is argumentation.